Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So today we are going to talk about, by far, the craziest group of soldiers that I ever worked with throughout my Special Forces career, and that is going to be our EOD technicians, all right? Explosive Ordnance Disposal, all right? I'm sure most of you guys are sort of somewhat familiar with what EOD does, but what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to walk you guys through all the things EOD actually does, how they support special operations, because we actually very often had them attached to our ODAs, and then I'm going to tell you guys some outrageous stories of things I watched EOD techs do right next to me on combat operations. That's absolutely insane. Okay, that really solidifies and will show you how crazy these dudes actually are. Okay, and been getting hounded by one of my buddies who was an EOD tech to do this video, so finally I'm getting it out there. All right, now let's talk a little bit first and just kind of explain to you guys what EOD does and what their purpose is. Okay, and they actually do quite a few different things, but obviously we all think of EOD, we think about disarming bombs, right? And yes, they do a lot of that, especially in Afghanistan with IEDs, okay? But they do a lot of other things also, right? So now, obviously, disarming IEDs, things like that was very prominent in Iraq and Afghanistan due to the prevalence of them, and that was their main tool to attack U.S. forces. All right, so a lot of that, but they also do things like breaching, okay, explosive breaching, knocking down walls, doors, things like that, so that the force doesn't actually have to go through main like funnels, like doorways, things like that, that are most likely common entrance and exit points that the Taliban or ISIS, whoever, would inlay IEDs. Okay, IEDs, if you don't know, is a explosive device, an improvised explosive device that you can put all sorts of places, but typically underneath the ground, and we'll explain how those work and how they actually disarm those here in a little bit. But they also blow in place, or we call bipping, caches. Caches are very often we would find huge stockpiles of explosives, rockets, mortars, ammunition, weapons, right? So when we need to just destroy massive amounts of those, we are going to use our own explosives to blow in place those, okay? And there's actually going to be a story at the end about my ODA that actually found and destroyed internally the largest cache of explosives ever found in Afghanistan, and got the video off of NATO News to show you guys here at the end of what that looked like when we blew it up. They deal with UXO, okay, unexploded ordnances, both in hostile areas, but also domestically as well, right? So an unexploded ordnance might be some artillery shell, right, that gets shot out, hits the ground, and doesn't explode, okay? It's potentially that thing could still blow up, but it hasn't yet, so they'll deal with things like that as well. Mines, okay, in a lot of foreign countries, unfortunately, especially in the last 100 years, so many landmines were placed on borders and things like that, so that is a real threat in a lot of places that they may have to deal with, and even underwater mines, which we'll talk about as it pertains to another thing that they can do to help enable SOF, and we'll talk about sort of how that might have looked in a place like North Korea as well as we go. So let's actually real quick talk about how EOD enables Special Operations Forces, because obviously EOD works throughout the military, not just in SOF, but they very often, and on my deployments, were attached to us. And a lot of people sometimes find that interesting, that know a lot about Special Forces, and that we have our own engineering and demolition sergeants as an MOS. Okay, it's basically part of the EOD tech job we have internally in 18 Charlies. So people wonder, why does a Special Forces ODA need an EOD tech? And the way I like to explain it is kind of also why we very often have Air Force combat controllers attached to the teams to do all of our JTAC or controlling aircraft stuff, is that even though someone like me that was a JTAC It's one of 7 different jobs that I'm trying to keep up with as a Green Beret, and I'm probably not that proficient at it comparatively to somebody who it's their primary MOS. So the 18 Charlie has a ton of things he has to stay maintained on, whereas EOD is specifically focused on EOD tasks. Okay, so that's why it's obviously beneficial to have a actual subject matter expert on it on the ground with you, particularly have 2 of them at a time. Now, in Afghanistan, right, what they would do is we typically have 2 on a team. They'd be attached to the team, and we would usually have, as we split up into 2 to 4 elements, one of those EOD techs on each of the main elements. Anytime we potentially ran into suspected IEDs, okay, mine sweeping, things like that, finding them, it would be their job to pull it out of the ground or get rid of it, which I'll tell you how that works later, which is insane. If we need to blow caches up, typically that's who we're going to rely on for that. Breaching, potentially, that as well, okay? So they're basically kind of an integral part to assist sort of in that 18 Charlie role, okay? So if you had 4 split up elements and only 2 18 Charlies, well, now you can actually augment 4 demolitions experts across all 4 elements, and that's very often how we did it as well, okay? So, and also, a lot of people didn't know about this about EOD, but they very often have special operations infill schools like Halo, Dive, things like that as well, much like CCTs, okay? Because so often they enable special operations teams, they need to also be able to infill via whatever platform that ODA or whoever is infilling by. So they actually get a lot of advanced schools like that as well on top of their EOD skill set. Okay, so that's sort of how they get augmented. Okay, now if you think about something like underwater operations, okay, when we were planning for potential invasion of North Korea, which was a real thing in like 2018, 2017, first Special Forces group that I was in was basically being tasked with the entire infiltration portion of that war, because our responsibility is Asia. Okay, so in that planning process, what we found is how are we going to get special operations troops into that country? Okay, it's very hard. You can't just fly in and land on an airfield. You get your aircraft shot out of the sky. One of the ways that was probably going to be an important way to do it would be to use dive, okay, to actually swim in. The problem with that is the entire coastline of North Korea is inlaid with water and naval mines, okay? So you would potentially need an EOD tech with your ODA that could dive, that could potentially help you navigate through that and disarm mines if they need it underwater, okay? So that's where holistically EOD can do a lot of different things for special operations teams. Now, talking about disarming IEDs, okay? So the most common IED, now there's tons of different kinds, right? This isn't an IED video. But the most common type of IED we would see, especially in Afghanistan, is what's called pressure plates, okay? I'll put a picture of it up here. It's basically, you can use just about anything for it, but very commonly 2 pieces of wood, right? Or plywood, 2x4, whatever. Okay, and in the center of that, and this is a dumbed down version of it, but they're basically 2 pieces of metal, okay, hooked to a charge. And when you step on that plywood, it's flexible, so it bends, right? And it's buried under the ground. You step, those 2 pieces of metal touch together, ignites a charge, travels down the wire, which is hooked to an artillery shell, a jug of homemade explosive that then explodes, okay? So typically these have pieces of metal in them, so EOD is using a minesweeper, typically clearing the way for the rest of the unit. And if they get in doorways or whatever a hit, which they think is an IED, they're going to, very often ours would, actually just, and the way they disarm these IEDs, guys, which is crazy to watch. I always, I'm going to step back 30 feet while you do this, but get down with their, literally like a stick, and start digging around to find basically the wires, and they basically get in there and rip the entire pressure plate out by the wires, and disable it so that we can continue on through. Okay, just think about that. This thing is hooked up to some type of massive explosive device that's going to literally probably just pink mist you if you do something wrong, and these guys just get in there and start jamming away like it's nothing, just ripping it out with their bare hands. It's actually insane to watch, okay? Not something I would ever do, but I watch these guys do it constantly, right? So Disarming IEDs, a huge one for EOD. Now, in Army EOD, it's interesting if you look up the Army EOD specialty is that they use robots, okay? Sure, in the conventional world, maybe, but when you're infilling with a Special Forces ODA with 12, 13 dudes on a helicopter in the middle of nowhere, you're not bringing robots, okay? So our robots are literally the EOD tech himself, right? So you got to have balls of steel to do that job, right? Again, breaching. We would typically almost always breach through the side of walls because the IED threat is so high, right? They're going to put it in doorways and entrances and exits to compounds. You blow a hole in the side of a random wall, most likely not going to be IEDs there, okay? So caches, we found caches ad nauseum. Every time we went out, massive caches, stockpiles of weapons. Like I said, I'll tell you a story and show you a video about the one we found. And then we went over sort of underwater and things like that. Okay, so that hopefully gives you guys a better idea of all the different things that EOD does, especially as they're enabling special operations or special forces team. Okay, so now let's talk about let's tell some stories about some of the most insane shit I saw anybody do in my deployment career from our EOD techs. All right, first one, and I'm going to call this a misfire story. All right, we had infilled into with the 160th actually, and into an area in, I believe, the Terran Cot region, doing a basic, raid through huge area of compounds and whatnot. Okay, and the place we were in was like basically IED alley. I see there was, tripwires everywhere. The whole place looked like it was rigged to blow. Okay, so just as some foreground to how sketchy this place was, and it was completely empty. There was nobody there when we first got there, which anytime you show up to a place like that that's completely empty is always super sketchy because they most likely have laid tons of IEDs and they've gotten out of the area. All right, so anyway, as we're moving through, we had found multiple caches of explosives and things like that in basements, different rooms, and we get towards actually sort of towards the end of the objective as we're moving up towards a tree line. It's kind of the last row of compounds, and as we're moving through, we find another basement, and our EOD tech looks down in there and sees massive cache of explosives, mortars, things like that. Okay, so we decide, hey, we're going to blow this in place, which, like I mentioned earlier, we're due, right? We're going to go down, EOD tech's going to set the explosives, blow it all up, right? So the way when we blow in place or bit things, there's two different ways you can do it, okay? You can use time fuse, which is basically an igniter hooked to a wire that slowly burns, so it gives you a set amount of time before that explosive goes off so you can get away from it, or an actual detonator, okay? An electrical charge that you literally just push, pull, boom, okay? So our EOD tech decided we're just going to use, a detonator for this, and it's just me and him at this point. We sent the rest of the element ahead to keep clearing. All right, I look down in this basement, and it looks like an episode of Hoarders, but if everything in that room was explosives, okay? He just runs down, okay, crawling through all this shit of explosives that, God forbid, who knows if it's rigged to blow or not, sets a bunch of C4 on it, rigs the charge, runs the detonating system all the way back up, took to a wire, right? We go and we stand on the side of the wall, which in hindsight probably wasn't very smart, okay, because this was down in a basement, but we're kind of standing on the side of the wall outside of the building, and he hands it to me, the detonator, and he goes, hey, do you want to blow this one? And I'm like, oh, okay, sure, why not, right? So the way it works is, our detonating systems, you do this push, quarter turn, pull. When you pull, boom, it's supposed to go boom, okay? So I go push, quarter turn, as we were next to the building like this. Nothing happens. And he's like, do it again. Push, quarter turn, pull. Nothing happens. And I'm like, oh shit, we've got a misfire, okay? Misfire is a serious situation because potentially I've already set off the charge to this. Something happened. It could still go off literally at any second, okay? Our EOD tech, after the two misfires, gets up, runs back down into this basement where there's this massive rigged full of explosive, which no one would ever do this. You're supposed to wait like a certain set amount of time, like 30 minutes to an hour before you ever get anywhere near it. He just immediately runs down back on top of this, re-rigs it, runs it back up, this time with a cord that's about 20 feet longer, okay? So we're actually able to get about 20 feet away from the building and get behind another of this mud wall, right? Give us another barrier, rather than being standing right next to the building, okay? So I go, this time, get down behind the wall, push, quarter turn, pull, boom, goes off, right? Massive explosion, right? So big that basically was raining rocks over the entire, on all of us, the entire unit. We had Afghans running for cover everywhere, right? We're kind of laughing, and then the dust settles, and I get up over the wall, and I look at the building that we were literally just standing next to, trying to get this to blow, and it's gone. And there's like a 10-foot crater in the ground, and I was like, well, it was probably a good thing that this didn't go off, because we would have been standing next to this building that's literally just vanished. Okay, so anybody who's in EOD or knows or been in military operations know how insane that is to just run back down on a misfired cache full of massive explosives. But they did it. All right, so next one I watched, same EOD tech in all these stories. He knows who he is. I wonder if he'll see this video. Watched him throw a satchel charge, basically, which was essentially a bag, okay, like a canvas bag, kind of like a Claymore carrying bag, that he put C4 in, right, and hooked it to a detonating system. And we were in the middle of taking a bunch of fire from inside of a compound, and we were right outside the walls, and ran up and basically just hucked this satchel charge into the door, because they were basically barricaded shooters in the back of this room we couldn't get into. Threw a satchel charge full of C4 through the doorway, and then ran behind the corner and ignited this thing off to blow up the building, which was also insane to watch somebody do, and just the thought process of doing that was crazy. And then the last one, okay, we're going to talk about the time, again, our ODA blew up the largest cache ever found in Afghanistan. Again, this was on NATO news, like a big deal, all right? So I'm not going to get into the whole story of that mission. I actually have a video about it, because the mission itself was super fucked up. We actually had to do it twice back to back, which is not a thing. So if you want to watch that video, I think it's still up on the YouTube channel. But anyway, we basically infilled into this this area that a year prior had been a super hotbed for Taliban leadership activity, and ODA had actually tried to get into this same area and compound, and took so much gunfire and casualties they had to emergency exfil out. So we were going back into a place we thought was going to be super intense. Turns out we get there was very little people there, but there was a ton. Within the first 5 minutes of moving up to the first compound, we found a massive cache of mortars and explosives and things like that. We get to the final compound, where we assume there's Taliban leadership and stuff like that, and it's completely empty. And it's this giant, and the compounds in Afghanistan typically have giant walls, right? And they'll be open area compounds with buildings and rooms and stuff like that around them. Okay, usually a big courtyard in the center for the livestock and things like that. So we get inside. There's a bunch of cars inside, and everything's completely quiet. Nobody there. Again, that's always the sketchiest. And first thing our EOD tech sees as he looks in one of the cars is this car is a VBED. It's a vehicle-borne IED. They turn vehicles into IEDs and then drive them up on compounds and blow them up. First vehicle he looks in is completely rigged. Like, it's a setup VBED. And there's a bunch of vehicles in here, and we realize, oh shit, okay, this is probably all rigged. All right, as we're moving through, I'm thinking I'm element leader at the time, so I'm managing everything that's going on. We got about 20, 30 guys inside this compound getting ready to try to figure out where to move to next. And my EOD tech comes up over the radio and is like, hey, I need you to come look at this building real quick. I need you to look in this room. Like, completely nonchalant, completely relaxed. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll go see what it is, right? Pulls me over, and we go and look inside this building, open this creaky door, and this building, I don't know, it's probably by, I would say, maybe 75 feet by 50 feet, so pretty big building, maybe about 12 feet tall. And we open the door, and it is literally from ground to ceiling for about 30 feet, 30, 40 feet back, bags of 50-pound bags of homemade explosives. So it ended up being 13,000 pounds of homemade explosives. So if you can imagine how many 50-pound bags of explosives does it make to make 13,000 pounds. I'm not going to do the math, but a lot. All right. Also, hundreds of artillery shells, mortar rockets, ammunition. It was this insanely massive cache. Again, it turned out being the biggest cache ever found in Afghanistan. Right. So we realized, okay, well, one, if this is rigged to blow and this goes off, everyone in a probably 500-foot radius is gone, is going to evaporate into pink mist. So that's sketchy by itself, right? So what do we have to do? And this is the second night we're back in there when we actually blow it, because the whole first night was a clusterfuck. They refused to strike it with air, and we left, ended up having to come back once the general found out what happened. Anyway, long story short, we get back the second night, and we have to blow it ourselves internally, organically, much with, like I talked about, blowing the cache. So our EOD tech is inside this building, basically, and laying this massive C4 bipping charge on top of the largest cache of explosives ever found in Afghanistan. Again, anything goes wrong here, and everyone in a 500, probably 500 foot, 1,000 foot, and you'll see the explosion here in a second, radius is dead. And this dude is doing this like while laughing and joking, setting it up like nothing. I'm literally butthole puckered to the rim, right? Like that's the sketchiest thing probably the sketchiest thing I've ever been a part of in all my time in war. And we set at I think we set a 3 to 5 minute time fuse on this one. So obviously can't push quarter turn pull this one with a detonator because we'd have to be 1,000 feet away for this thing to blow. So we sent everybody back, probably like half a mile at this point, just a few of us there finishing setting up this thing. We set off the 3 to 5 minute time fuse and basically all just sprint for what probably was about half a mile to get away from this thing before it exploded. And then luckily we had ISR watching this. Okay, so here is the video. As you guys can see, those tiny little walls and squares on the ground, those are buildings. That's the compound, and this compound was huge. It was probably hundreds of feet, or probably 500 feet by 500 feet, right? So and when it went off, it looked like a nuclear bomb went off. And that explosion is literally from again, we just use C4 to ignite the explosion. That is how much explosive how much explosives were in that compound that went off organically to make that explosion. I think we were probably close to 1,000 feet away when it went off, and the shock wave of that explosion went through me in my chest, and it felt like being next to a door charge, right? You could make you got to keep your mouth open, because if you clench your teeth, it'll smash all your teeth out with the explosive blast. Absolutely insane, okay? And that was also all done by our EOD techs, okay? So you can see why special operations teams like having guys that are insane enough to handle the explosive side of the job, because it is nuts. All right, so there's a movie, The Hurt Locker, that sort of is a good representation of that, right? If you're interested. But yeah, that's gonna about do it to wrap it up. Again, the stuff I watch these dudes do and like nonchalantly, completely relax, absolutely insane. Another note: every EOD tech I have ever met has the most insane, morbid sense of humor ever. They all, and I guess you kind of have to, right? If you know your job entails the slightest misstep is gonna basically leave you turned into dust at any moment, and that's what you do for a career, I think you got to be a little psycho in the head. So all of you who are interested in joining the military and think you want to go EOD, that's what you've got in store for you. So, all right, hope you guys found this interesting. All right, and I will catch y'all in the next one.